Hello and welcome to TBRCon2022. My name is Beth Tabler and I will be hosting this fantastic panel on fantasy through the decades. First and foremost, I'd love my panel to introduce themselves. Peter, do you want to go first?
Hi, I'm Peter V. Brett, author of The Demon Cycle and the Nightfall Saga from Del Rey Books. Happy to be here.
Hi, I'll go next.
Okay.
Anthony Ryan, author of the Raven Shadow trilogy, the Raven's Blade duology, the Draconis Memoria, and the Seven Swords novella series.
Okay, Michael, do you want to go?
I'm Michael J. Sullivan, broadcasting to you live from the parking lot. And I write Raya Revelations and Legends of the First Empire. And hey, I didn't even know we had Anthony Ryan here. Cool. I got a lot of cool people on this panel. Thank you.
And Janny, do you want to go?
I've been an author and an illustrator for something like 40 years. I've got 36 short stories in print, and I just completed my 20th novel, which is the finale for the Wars of Light and Shadow, also known for standalones and trilogies. You can find my website because I'm the only Janny Wurts in the world. But here we are. I'm delighted to be here.
Whereas I'm at war with the Peter Brett, who has peterbrett.com. He's like an architect.
Did you send him a stern letter?
Well, the thing is, he had peterbrett.com, but he wasn't using it, and that was the worst. But you know, we defer quite a bit in our books, so there's not much confusion. If you want to learn about carpentry and joinery, you can follow the other Peter Brett.
I bet your fans drive him crazy.
I think the perfect place to start is just to have a baseline is what is fantasy and how would a reader recognize fantasy versus, say, like science fiction?
I mean, the simplest definition is magic versus science, you know, so fantasy, the conceit that takes it out of the natural and into the supernatural is magic. And in science fiction, that conceit is some level of technology that's more advanced than what we currently have. And then you have the places where it crosses over, like Star Wars, where the Force is clearly magic and like the tech is sort of science fiction.
What about the midichlorians?
I mean, they quickly abandoned the midichlorians, and and even then it was still magic. There was no science to that.
Yeah, it's
Little hand wavy.
Star Wars,
Science fiction is just pretentious. It's really fantasy. They like to pretend it isn't, but honest to God, it is. It truly is. Anything that happens in your imagination, anything that's the language of dreams, anything that goes where we haven't gone before, that's fantasy. It might become reality at some point, but how do we break the envelope? You have to imagine it first.
So you're saying
I think it comes down a little more to trope.
Yeah, it's a trope of fantasy. Science fiction is a trope of fantasy. Now they're going to attack me.
Wow. Okay.
Well, I was just thinking that it comes down to trope as to what's in the story. If it's got a spaceship in it, it's probably going to be science fiction, at least labeled that and put in the same area. But of course, as they always seem to be, if you come to any bookstore, at least they used to be, it's always science fiction. And inside that would be fantasy for some reason. You never could find a fantasy section in a bookstore for the longest time. I was looking for it and like, oh, it's under science fiction. I'm like, well, that doesn't seem right.
So you're suggesting that science fiction owns fantasy?
No, I'm suggesting fantasy.
No, I'm suggesting that.
Fantasy and science fiction.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
And they can fight me to the death. I'll die on this hill.
Well, they're going to come for us now.
Let them come.
I just work here.
Aiming torches towards.
No, that's a reasonable argument. All your bases are ours now.
It's a good thing to bring up. Like space fantasies like Dune and Star Wars were obviously huge. And they have successfully, at least I think, blended science fiction and fantasy. Has that had a far-reaching effect on fantasy as a genre? You know, did they get people interested in fantasy and reading
I don't
fantasy
think
novels?
so. I mean, look at what's going on right now. They're giving death threats to doctors. How more sciencey can you get? Nothing's changed. They burned women who were healers as witches. So if you don't believe in it, it's
Well, that's changed, sort of. Yeah. Star Wars definitely led me down a path to fantasy when I was a kid. Absolutely. Yeah. Because there was sword fighting, and sword fighting, there was no other science fiction book where you could find sword fighting. And so in order to do that, you had to move into fantasy. And between that and, the Jedi basically being space wizards, like, I think that definitely took me down a path of reading fantasy books, as opposed to, like when I was a kid, it was a big, like, which is better, Star Wars or Star Trek? And Star Trek was for the science fiction people, and Star Wars was for the fantasy people. So I was on Team Star Wars, at least as a kid.
I've always been struck by how much, especially early science fiction, a lot of it relies on telepathy and ESP being an actual thing. As far as science is concerned, they're not actual things. There's no such thing as telepathy or ESP. It crops up again and again in a lot of science fiction because it's so useful as a plot device. But it's a fantasy element,
Peter,
Dune especially is crammed with it.
Sorry, Anthony. Peter, I would challenge you that Star Wars was the first swords in science fiction. Go back to Dune.
I was a little young for Dune when it first came out, so like I had a different gateway. I didn't read Dune until I was an adult.
Yeah, well, see, that was way before Star Wars.
That's fair.
Like what Dune is, 1967?
Yes, I don't know the exact.
It was -6.
That was -3. I think I did read Dune too early though to fully get it. I didn't really appreciate it until I read it again in my late teens, having tried to read it when I was 13 or something. It's an amazing book, but it's definitely a mashup of fantasy and science fiction.
And then you go to Zelazny. He had a lot of stuff that was bizarrely science fiction and fantasy at the same time.
Zelazny, yeah.
Well, I mean, this is the real.
Really read Zelazny.
Everyone has their own gateway, and a lot of times, like, what was the gateway for people slightly older than you is not the gateway, for not even another generation, even just like part of the same generation. I've never read Zelazny. I've never read a lot of the classic science fiction and fantasy authors because that's not what was filling the bookshelves when I was haunting Walden Books, when I was 13. And so I would buy what was there, and it was much more mainstream modern stuff than it was like classic. And I think at that age, the classic science fiction was a little too dense for me anyway. And so by the time I was old enough to appreciate it, I'd already been on the path for quite some time.
I was going to ask about that. Is it essential to read classic fantasy? And if so, why? But it's not, right? I mean,
it's not essential to read anything. You
Yeah.
read what you like. You read what interests you and what gives you passion. And like anyone who tells you that you have to read the classics in order to write in a certain genre or to understand a certain genre is just being pretentious. It's just not true.
Totally, you're right. Absolutely, totally. But one thing where I feel it's really sad is sometimes there are works that come from those earlier periods, like say Zelazny, that were so far ahead of their time. They're so far outside the envelope. They don't read like anything being written anywhere. It's well worth looking into. So when they're just sort of shoved off the table with don't bother with this because it's classic, there's different breeds of classics. Some are dense and hard to read. Some are exceptionally easy to access. And some of them have some ideas that no writer today is even trying to touch.
And it's great to be turned on to something new. And like, I'm not suggesting that you should avoid something just because it's a classic, but just the idea that there's any one thing that's essential, that there's any one gateway or foundation that's essential to understanding a genre is just, I don't sit with that.
I would agree.
I actually think that it would be better to read outside the genre because then you can draw new things into it as opposed to kind of regurgitating the same old.
Well, it was one of the advantages growing up where there wasn't very much science fiction and fantasy. I read the entire library before I even discovered it. So all the other genres came ahead of science fiction and fantasy for me.
I started with the Belgariad. That was my gateway.
That's a nice stable entry point.
Yeah. Yeah, and those kind of 80s D&D-esque type books.
That was very much my entry point too.
Yeah.
The Prydain Chronicles, Lord Alexander, that was my first real introduction to. I can't think of a better starting point.
So I'm the most cliche of all. I came in through Tolkien.
Yeah. The Hobbit was the first book without pictures that I ever read, like of my own free will. But then I went to Terry Brooks, and from there it was like Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance novels. And then, you know, once I'd read all of those, then I started expanding into other things. Everybody has their own way to fall into this sort of thing. And in some ways it's good because it lets you bring a fresh eye and fresh creativity to something when you don't feel trapped by some other classic piece that you never read. It allows you to like have your own take on things. But a lot of us got stuck in the Tolkien mold for a while.
Yeah.
Because D&D is essentially like an extension of Tolkien. And like from the beginning, they're like, well, let's just take all the stuff in The Hobbit because that's what everyone loves, and we'll reincorporate those races.
I want to put a challenge to you guys, which I put to Beth earlier, and that is, okay, everybody did this copy Tolkien thing. I want you to name me one woman in that time period who copied Tolkien. Give me one.
In what time period?
Any time period.
That's a fair point. I can't think of that.
Path. None of them.
Absolutely, Green was not.
I get stumped on that question. I need to see who was a woman who copied Tolkien, and I can't come up with one.
I mean, there were women writing like D&D like. There were certainly plenty of women writing Dungeons and Dragons tie-in books, and like, you know, Dragonlance was all an extension of Tolkien, like Forgotten Realms. So like that was working within a work for hire framework. So I don't know if that counts to your point.
What about the Wizard of Earthsea?
That really was.
Yeah, I would say that's not really.
That was very much Taoism.
Okay.
You know, where's
well, when I read Tolkien, when Tolkien I was reading that, after I got done with it, I literally couldn't find anything else to read. And Le Guin's books were the first thing I found that was interesting. But after that, I actually strayed away from fantasy because I couldn't find anything of the same quality. So I actually started going off into science fiction and then farther out into like Stephen King and stuff because I really had a hard time finding it. And I kept coming back looking for something good that would really catch my attention, and there wasn't a lot. So I guess I don't really have quite the same background as most of these people in fantasy because I strayed away early, and then when I came back, I didn't even know it had changed. So I
got on Donaldson then because he was about that time.
No, not Donaldson. I did check out Terry Brooks, but I did find him a little too close to Tolkien for my comfort. And I did go to the Belgrade series, and I did go to Feist when he came out. But those were like the highlights. I didn't do a lot of deep reading going back because I almost this stuff was not to my liking, so I actually just kind of strayed away.
I bounced around a bit until I got to Wheel of Time. And then the Wheel of Time really solidified me in the fantasy genre.
How old were you at the time?
Wheel of Time, I was 15.
Yeah. I think there was a perfect window where you were the right age to hit it for that one. And you either passed it or before it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I started Wheel of Time in my 20s, and you know, it's a slow series, but worth it if you really invest in it. And it's the only book series I've ever had on a New York City subway where I would be reading on a New York City subway and consistently people would come over and want to talk to me about it. Like, New Yorkers do not talk to each other at all on the subway. But if I had a Wheel of Time book and I was reading it, there was like a 20% chance that somebody was going to come over and start talking to me about it, like excitedly, because finally they have somebody to talk to about it.
See,
So no other book has had that effect.
I found Dorothy Dunnett in my 20s, and that destroyed me. Boom, right there. And a lot of fantasy and science fiction writers have been influenced by her work tremendously. George Martin has, the guy who wrote Dagger and the Coin has, Ellen Kushner, Guy Kay. Who else recently? The Red Knight, Miles Cameron. So the list of people influenced by that historical author is just immense. She plots like nobody else, but they're deep books.
Who's this?
Dorothy Dunnett. She wrote the Lyman Chronicles, The House of Niccolo, and she did a Macbeth, which is a fascinating Macbeth because he is not the evil guy. He's the one who united Britain. So historically accurate that you don't have to read the history. But she writes fictional characters woven into it. And they're astonishing books, but they're not for the light of heart. In other words, it's a read that makes you work because she keeps turning things on their head. So it's kind of an underground, people know. I mean, George Martin read her. You can tell, you can read a book and you can almost tell, you can see the influence there. So Game of Thrones, A Game of Kings, that's the opening of the Lyman Chronicles. You can see. So yeah, that destroyed me in my 20s for a lot of fantasy because it was so well done.
Oh. Yeah, I haven't read those. Have you guys read those?
Change the markers.
I haven't. There's a Scottish author, Nigel Tranter, I think is in a similar mold. Writes almost exclusively about Scottish history. He got a very long series about Robert the Bruce, for example, William Wallace and all of that. How historically accurate he is open to question, but I did find those kind of fascinating and certainly informative in terms of what I write today.
I've read Nigel Tranter, and the level of complexity is way less than a Dunnett book.
Yeah,
a Dunnett book for real deep dives. But yeah, Nigel Tranter writes a good historical novel. They're excellent.
Why is fantasy important to culture? You know, does fantasy echo what's going on in the world?
I think it echoes a kind of belief, really. It's like a language of dreams. So it's tracking what society considers their myths, what's important, what isn't, what moral things are important, or where you're going to break the envelope. If you don't ever break the envelope, if you don't ever imagine anything, you know, neither go forward, no back, you're totally stuck in one place. So to me, fantasy is the differentiation of being human. We can extrapolate and we can imagine. Mm-hmm. If we couldn't do that, what would we be doing? Staying in the same place all the time.
Anthony, what were you saying?
Yeah, for me, I think like what Janny was saying, it's the ability to do anything with fantasy. You can go anywhere with it. There's no real limit. You do have to create a world and sell the fantasy that you're creating. But once you've done that, you can go anywhere with it and explore any theme. And it's limitless, really. That's the attraction of it for me. And I think that's its wider cultural significance. Also, I don't think there's anything wrong with escapism. People reading fantasy for escapism. I don't think there's anything wrong in that. Why not give people an escape? Just how I see it.
I think that, I mean, obviously you can just have escapism. You can just have entertainment in fantasy and in all literature. But what's most powerful about books is to allow you to put yourself in the position of someone unlike you, or the experiences that you haven't had, from a safe space where you can explore feelings and emotions and thoughts, you know, from the comfort of your own armchair, and yet project yourself into them and have those experiences. And also what I like about fantasy, particularly second world fantasy, is that you can talk about the real world without actually pointing a finger at anybody. And, you know, people get their guard up if you point a finger at them and talk about them. But if you present your characters with a problem that's similar to the problems that we have in the real world and have them work through it, that can make a statement and in some ways influence people to think a different way without getting their guard up. And that, I think, is something that is one of the most powerful aspects of fantasy writing and what I am most drawn to in it.
I think, generally speaking, any kind of fiction helps with empathy. If you can put the reader into the shoes of another person who's a bit unlike them, in fact, if it's someone who they normally would be against, but again, you see them on the hero's journey, or you see them moving through challenges, and you get a chance to see the world through their eyes. And just like Peter's saying, that yes, if you do that in fantasy, you can approach it in ways that don't immediately shut down the mind of the person who's reading it. Also, as Jen was saying, was that the fantasy has always been kind of a way for society to kind of not only say who we are, but also what we would like to be. And you can go to different places and say, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't go into the woods at night, or you'll be eaten by a gingerbread house or something. These are ways of trying to warn people against bad, behavior, and try to encourage good behavior that society tends to like to reflect. And of course, fantasy changes throughout time, just as society does. So I think there's a great deal of value in any fiction, really, as far as learning empathy for other people and other races and other cultures.
There's a documentary film called Fantastic Journeys, and it goes back to a 2,000-year-old story, which is basically a hero's journey, and it points up all the mythologies of all the different cultures, and it said if we understood their stories, we would not have any wars, because we would understand what their values were. But yeah, Mythic Journeys, it won a lot of awards. It's like about a half-an-hour documentary. You can rent it from Netflix. But that's a fascinating.
Yeah, I think I've seen parts of that.
Yeah, what fantasy does in each of in all of our world societies, and how it could create intersections between cultures if we took the time to know their stories.
That actually brings me to my next question. Does fantasy have to have a moral lesson?
No.
Well, I'm just,
No.
It can, and it often does, but it doesn't have to.
Yeah, it's perfectly valid for any form of fiction to have no message or no point of view at all. It's whatever the author wants it to be.
Okay.
Or you can guide the reader to a moral quandary, but in the end, they're going to have to decide how they feel about it. Because if the author tells them how to feel about it, there's a 50-50 chance they're going to feel the opposite just because they're a contrary person. But if you leave a position where they have to puzzle that answer out themselves, like, it's always good to take a moment and think about morality and where you stand. But it is hubris to think that as an author you can influence that more than just a little bit.
It doesn't
You're
have
certainly
to
not
have
going
a
to tell
message.
them what's what.
What's
that, Janny?
Want to escape, and that's important, because when you can't escape your real world situations, sometimes reading a book that doesn't challenge boundaries is exactly what you need. Annie McCaffrey had a quilt on her wall in her guest room that had squares, and each square was sewn by somebody whose life was saved because of her books. Either they were suicidal, or they were in a very bad health situation, they were in the hospital, or they were in a position of no hope in their life. And her books gave them a direction. And I saw that quilt and I just cried, because it is pretentious when you say this book doesn't have a place, or every book has to challenge a boundary, or every book has to have a moral premise. It absolutely doesn't. I think there's room in the tent for all of it, all of it. Do it, because life is going to be saved, or somebody's going to get the idea they needed, or the thought, or the direction changed in their lives. You don't know what your book is going to do, or what any book out there is going to do for somebody else. So I'm a believer in letting everything run.
Sure.
I've never heard that quilt story. That's amazing.
Oh, it was amazing. And
did she make it herself, or did each person contribute a square?
Squares, and gave her the squares, and then they sewed them up in one quilt, and she hung it in her guest room. It was over the guest bed.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. So you don't know where any book is going to go. So why put somebody else's book down or say this is fantasy and that is not, when you don't know whose life could be saved because that book that you panned needed to go where it needed to go. There's room for
the longer I've been in this business, the less desire I have to criticize any other artist for what they do. You know, in the beginning, I had a lot of opinions. And then just the more it's gone on, the more I feel like writing books is hard, and telling stories is hard, and like sticking the landing is hard, and everybody brings their own baggage to a book, and what works for somebody doesn't work for somebody else. And so like I feel less and less like it's valid to criticize what other people are doing when I realize just how subjective all of it is.
The minute you add a reader, it's another book. Think how many different reflections of one book is out there in that world, because the minute you add a reader, it's a different experience. We each bring our own stuff to that book, those words on the page, and they mean something different to every person who picks up that book.
Well, oh yeah, I mean, I always kind of feel like when you write a book, you're only really writing half. The other person, the reader, is going to bring the other half. And it's amazing that sometimes they'll bring the opposite half as someone else. The things that one person likes was exactly what the other reader hated, and vice versa. And that's always fascinating, because it's like sometimes when you're trying to look at readers for help in direction and where you're going, it's often almost ridiculously hard to do that, because what one person liked, the other person hated. It's like, well, what do you do with that? So if you're trying to improve, sometimes it's like, well, I don't know how to do this now, because I'm appealing to one group and not another, and this person saw something in it that I didn't even know I put in it, and that person saw something in it when I did want it in it, which was great for me. But sometimes the things you don't even know you put in it are the things that really change people's lives. And I'm sure everyone here has probably received email or written mail of appreciation of some sort. And it's always weird and sort of humbling, because you don't feel like you did it, but somehow something you did resulted in that. And so, I mean, it's a heck of a lot better than having someone tell you they went and shot up some story because of what you wrote. But at the same time, you really can't take general credit for it, because that was not your intent. But yeah, it's kind of amazing how this process works, and you don't even know what you're doing sometimes. But hopefully the idea, I think, for everyone is that the end result is resulting in something that is positive rather than negative.
Yeah. And that's part of the job of the writer is to choose, you know, like I get tons of hate mail about one specific character that people really, really don't like. But that character is also the one that's most cosplayed and has tons of fan art about them. And so like there are huge fans and there are people who hate them. And as a writer, I have to kind of ignore both and follow the path that I think is right, because once you start listening to people's feedback on that sort of thing, it's not your book anymore, and it can go off the rails because people are imprinting their own vision on what you were doing.
It was like the day I got 2 pieces of fan mail in the same day, and one absolutely excoriating what I had done with one character in the book, and the other email of that person saying it was, how could I do it? How could I possibly do this to the other character? So what I did was took the letters and sent them to the opposite reader. They came from the spectrum, and I said, okay, which one do I make happy and who gets to murder me?
Good use of excoriating there too. We don't hear that very often. I love that word.
Great word choice.
I don't get to use that word
somebody said, story is the gift of experience you give to somebody else. And after that, it's theirs. They're going to make it or break it.
Yeah.
So you just let it go.
Well, it's always fascinating when you have people talking about your characters and they say things like, oh, that character would never do that. I mean, to them, they know this person almost better than you do. And you're like, you can have an argument, but, oh, no, that character wouldn't do that. It's like, okay.
What book do you think is the most influential fantasy pre-Tolkien? Just in your opinions.
Wow, that's
Odyssey.
Probably Odyssey.
Odyssey?
Yeah.
Homer. Pretty much Homer.
Narrowing it down to a single book, I mean, I can point to authors like Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard as being I think, hugely influential in their own way, albeit being very problematic individuals these days. But pointing to a singular book before Tolkien came along is, I honestly can't think of one. You do kind of have to go all the way
Well,
back.
William Morris comes to mind. You can say William Morris seems to come to mind, since I think Tolkien knew about him, and it was kind of like a stepping stone between a more archaic, dense, 19th century writing style, and then Tolkien seemed to adopt a lot of his ideas, but bring it into a much more readable sense. So, I mean, maybe that one? I don't know. It's a hard question.
The Greek myths, you have to look at the Celtic myths, you have to look at all the child's ballads, you have to look at the Eddas, which is where Tolkien got a lot of his ideas from. I think a lot of those old mythic tales, Beowulf, there was a lot of pre-Tolkien stuff out there that all of that fantasy drew from, and you really can't separate it. It's one rope that just goes all the way back through the ages.
Yeah.
The only thing is that William Morris was the first.
All that.
But I think William Morris was the first person who ever wrote an invented world fantasy where it didn't actually take place on Earth. So that I consider a kind of a landmark piece.
Was he before the Islandia?
Say again?
Dates. I'm not good with numbers, but yeah, William Tappan Wright.
It would have been around. It would have been around 1850, I think.
And then how do you parse that from the Irish, where they went back and forth from fairy? They stepped through portals all the time in those old ballads and those old myths. I think other world fantasy.
Yeah, but that's more along the lines of Narnia, right?
No, not talking about Narnia.
Yeah, where you start in the real world, you step out.
I'm talking about the Red Book, the Red Branch, all of the stuff that James Cavill drew from.
I know.
So
I know. What I'm saying is that I think it still links into the real world, whereas William Morris was completely different world. The way Tolkien had Middle Earth, which I don't know. I guess you could argue it could be part of this world too.
So you're talking about portal fantasy versus second world fantasy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Portal fantasy, like I stepped into a fairy ring and now I'm not on Earth anymore, as opposed to what is Earth? This is our different world.
Going in a lot of the old myths.
Right.
Yeah.
What about Alice in Wonderland?
Portal
Where does
fantasy.
Portal fantasy, 1880s? I think something. And
Let's
there's
find out.
Peter Pan.
It was 1890.
Well, yeah, you have Peter Pan. You have, but those were, I think.
Yeah.
Wouldn't they mostly considered children's works?
Most of fantasy was pushed into children's, but that
Yeah.
shouldn't have been there. A lot of it wasn't. That's a modern thing, making a kid stuff.
I never thought of Alice
Yeah.
in Wonderland as for
But I think
children.
that's interesting.
Well, Alice in Wonderland is also, I don't know, like I never really thought of, I guess it technically is fantasy, but I always put that in the category of like, oh, this was a strange dream.
Drug fantasy. We haven't gone into drug fantasy.
Absinthe fantasy.
What kind?
Absinthe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
They all use that lead-based makeup too.
Yeah, that's true.
They were definitely wackos writing. I saw a bizarre article. I wish I'd cut it out of a magazine, but it literally went back into the 1500s, and there were women novelists writing stuff that was fantasy back then, and it's completely been erased. I wish I'd clipped the article. I'm like, holy crap, I didn't even hear of these women doing this stuff, but they were.
Well, the Brontes wrote fantasy.
Oh yeah, there's all kinds of.
That's true.
These were before the Brontes.
Yeah.
Well, if Janny's argument that science fiction is just a subsection of fantasy, then Frankenstein comes to mind as being pre-Tolkien and a fantasy that's still incredibly influential today.
Dracula.
Yeah, so is horror a subgenre of fantasy?
Oh, yeah,
then?
of course.
If science fiction is?
Totally.
All your base are belong to us.
Pitchforks.
They can come for me, but I can run pretty fast.
You can have horror that is nothing to do, that has no supernatural elements, but it's still a horror movie. You know, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a horror movie, but there's no supernatural element to it. But yeah,
That's
I mean,
true.
a lot of horror does revolve around fantastical elements when you think about it.
Yeah.
Cthulhu, that type of fantasy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Lovecraft was another one I tried to read, probably too young, because he's got a very dense writing style, which when you're young is kind of hard to get.
I think I'm too young to read it now.
Yeah.
all the horror writers that I read when I was a kid, you know, James Herbert and Stephen King and Clive Barker, like all of them ventured into fantasy constantly. You know, even Stephen King, who set the vast majority of his stories in the real world, like there was a supernatural element in almost every one of them that got the ball rolling. And I think that's why I was so drawn to those books, was that there was always something like out of the ordinary that was driving the story, and it was creating the conceit that made the story work.
We haven't even tapped the stuff that goes on in Native American myth. You start reading some of that stuff or other cultures' myths, there's plenty of stuff that's definitely outside the scale of what we consider real.
Absolutely.
So we're really limiting this discussion to Western writers in many ways, but there's an awful lot else out there that's way off the scale. If you take the time to read some of that mythic stuff or talk to the people from those cultures, you can hear some pretty amazing stuff.
So now you're also absorbing mythology into fantasy. Just to be clear, like everything belongs to fantasy. So like,
didn't I come out?
That means religion is basically.
Oh, don't go there.
The walls are getting thin.
Yeah, they are. They definitely are. But yeah, every culture has its myth.
Well, you can take it once.
Go ahead, Michael.
You can take it one step further and basically say anything that's fiction is fantasy.
All fiction is fantasy.
Well, if you talk to some people writing nonfiction, they'll insist that's true to their dying breath too. They'll die on that hill.
Well, it is. I mean, by sheer definition, fiction means it's untrue. You're basically telling something that didn't happen. So therefore, it's something you made up. Therefore, it must be fantasy.
All your base are belong to
Wow, we just claimed all of literature as our genre, as a subgenre of fantasy. I like it.
I guess we've won then.
But think about it. It had to be fantasy before it was real. They had to dream of flying before they made it happen. They had to dream about what they couldn't see before they discovered the atom. You don't go anywhere if you don't have imagination. Imagination precedes all of it. The dream comes first. Then you follow that dream. Without the dream, you're nothing.
Yep.
This actually leads into another question. We see more and more blending of fantasy genres. We get subgenres. Is genre labeling still very important?
As a
or does it even matter?
Publishers find it really important because they have to categorize it. It's a part of the business model that it has to be categorized.
I think
in terms of, is it actually useful to you as a writer to have something that's so pared down these days, where there's so many subcategories and subgenres? I think sometimes it can be a bit constricting.
Okay.
And not necessarily so. I think the genre is very useful as a sales tool. It's useful to, when people say, hey, I like this book, I want another book that's like that. Genre is helpful in getting them to find what it is they're looking for. But I think the moment that writers try and figure out the rules of a genre and follow those rules, they are limiting themselves unnecessarily, and it's seldom for the best. And I think a lot of times writers will attempt to follow the rules, and then the rules change on them before they even finish their book. And then they're left, with something that they tried to make a prefabricated thing to fit what they thought the market wanted, and then the market changed on them. So as a writer, I don't give a lot of thought to what other epic fantasy authors are doing, or what other like people straying into YA are doing. Like, I focus on my own work and let the salespeople work out what genre they want to sell it as, or, you know, like whether it counts as grimdark or not. Like, I don't give a damn if it counts as grimdark or not. You know, like that's something for readers and booksellers to debate, not for the author themselves.
I think even more confining than genre right now is the algorithm. The algorithm is absolutely trampling over everything, where machine numbers say what you even see. And so fighting that is much harder than fighting a genre boundary, because everybody's blending them anyway. Though 30 years ago, I had books refused because I blended genres, and they said, "Oh, you can't do that." I did it anyway. But the whole thing is that if the algorithm says this book is going to recommend that book, and that book, and these numbers get pushed up and others get pushed down, that to me is more insidious than genre divisions by a lot.
Are we talking about Amazon? The Amazon?
We're talking about internet algorithm, Amazon numbers determining what it is you even see. And when something falls outside those definitions, if the tags aren't right, or if the sales patterns don't follow, or the algorithm doesn't, because it's unintentional, the algorithm doesn't think.
Mm-hmm.
So it tends to shade meaning in where meaning isn't there. So I think readers are missing a tremendous number of books that they would love, that they can't see because of the way the internet sorts.
Well, it's a catch-22 though, because at the same time, when I was younger and a much more voracious reader, when I had a lot more free hours to read and a lot more desire to consume books, I was limited to like what they had at the Doubleday at the Galleria Mall, and like what they had at the comic book store, and what they had in the library, and that was it. And so then you have, you know, a couple of tastemakers, like whoever the SF book buyer was at Doubleday Books, and, you know, the librarian who's choosing what to stock the fantasy section with are then taste making my experience rather than an algorithm. Because like when I was younger, like there was no other option to search for more stuff. Like you had you could get what the store had, and you didn't know to ask for something that you didn't know existed. Whereas now you can browse anything if you start looking, but the algorithm will certainly serve you things that are immediately on the page for you to look at, but you have the choice of searching deeper if you choose to. I'm not denying that the algorithm has changed the game in a way that is not positive for everyone, and in fact makes things a lot harder to get noticed early in your career. But there are also benefits to having, you know, the world's literature at your fingertips if you're willing to do a little digging.
I know the algorithm is particularly difficult for self-published authors trying to get their work out.
Some of them.
Some of
I mean,
them.
I know some self-published authors who've learned how to work it and get their books in front of everybody. But it's an additional skill set that you don't necessarily have as a writer. Some writers have it and some writers don't.
One of the things that was different, I realized, yes, when bookstores and distribution, there was definitely a chokehold and a lock as to what got onto the shelves, but there was a difference because when you browsed books, you didn't have 50 reviews hitting you in the eyes. You didn't have 50 million ratings. There was no star average. You actually browsed the books by picking them off the shelf and reading a paragraph or two. So in a way, you were exposed to more things that you would not have read than now, when you can use the internet and browse everything, unless you use the read inside this book function. But if you don't even see the book, you can't browse it.
Yeah. No, it's.
Yeah, but at the same time, at the stores, you have a handful of shelves. If you go to Amazon, you literally will see thousands of books at a glance. You can scroll through them. You can look at this author who I like, you'll see other things like them. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to look at. And I don't know about anyone else, but I would never buy a book unless I read at least the first few pages of it because that doesn't make any sense to me. So yes, I mean, I would think most people do use the look inside.
Yeah, I'm finding it harder to find books. Because if I use that function and it says people who bought this book like that book, and I browse them, they're not what I'm looking for. It's missing the books that I really want to, definitely. So I have to really fight to find now what I could have found easily.
Well, used to be, and I hope this is still true, but it used to be the best way of finding something is to get it referred to you by someone else, which if you were to use a site like Goodreads where people post books that they like and you see a number of the books that you like on their shelves, you can assume that their taste is similar to yours, which then means, hey, they really like this book, they've rated it really well, and I like their other book, so this is a book I could look at. So there does seem to be a greater sense of ability to do discoverability, like Peter's saying now, than there were when you just simply had either a library. A librarian could definitely help you a lot. Teachers helped me a lot, too, to point me in new directions. But if you don't have access to those two things as easily, particularly if you're trapped in a pandemic, then yeah, there's still means that you can go and find other people who like books like yours, who will also come out and say, hey, this is a new book. Have you read this one? I love this one. And you're like, all right, well, I'll look at it. So, I mean, I think there's greater discoverability now than ever before. But you do have to kind of be able to work, you know, to figure out where to go to find that information, just like I suppose you had to do, you know, when you were looking through libraries. You had to find that right teacher or that right librarian who knew what you wanted, and they could tell you the kind of books that you like. Because I had people refer to me books, you know, before the internet, and it was terrible. But at the same time, I had a few of them that would say, hey, have you read Dune? Have you read Foundation? Have you read Watership Down? And they were absolutely right, and I never would have found these books otherwise. So I still think the best way to find a book, quite frankly, is to have someone of like-minded interest refer it to you. And if you can find those people or find a source for those people, and in today's internet society, you can generally find those things easier than you could, you know, as a kid in your house with no ability to drive a car.
Yeah, I think
fantastic.
I was.
Yeah, what?
Oh, Peter,
no,
go ahead.
you finish. You go, Jenny. You were going to say something.
No, I'm all right.
I just like I was an introvert as a kid. Like I wasn't talking to the librarian. I wasn't talking to the bookseller. Like I would go in and just look at the cover, read the back, and maybe read a page or two of every book until I found one that spoke to me. And so I think that I was much more likely to pick a book that maybe nobody had ever heard of, or maybe that wasn't popular, or that was sort of off the beaten path, because I was using my own taste to try and pick something without a personal recommendation or, you know, 2,000 reviews on Goodreads or whatever to help influence that. And so I think I was much more likely to take a chance on a book that was from a new author or was, you know, outside of the mainstream or whatever because of that. Whereas now, like, I don't know that that's necessarily the case because there's so many voices telling you what to do. And the moment you click on a book, you see how many reviews it has, you see how many stars it has, and you subconsciously make a bunch of calculations as to whether or not this is worth your time. Whereas before, it was just there was a physical thing, and you could pick it up and look at it and decide if you wanted it or not.
Wouldn't you love to see you click on the book and you see a sample of the prose, and then if you want to see the reviews, you click on the reviews, but instead you see the damn star rating the reviews first thing. I hate it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going away, but like.
And everybody loves those 1-star ratings that are given to you because they feel your book is overpriced.
Yeah.
One of the
and
things,
you know, it's something that all writers have a control over, right?
That's awful.
When I want to make myself feel better as an artist, I will go and read the 1-star reviews of books that I love. Like I'll pick my favorite books and then I'll go read the 1-star reviews of them, and then I feel a lot better about like reviews of my own books.
So what do you guys think about this decade of fantasy? This is something I'm wondering, where everybody and their uncle has an opinion about where they want the world to go or what they want to see or what they expect out of a book or and you get hit with that no matter where you go. There's going to be that dogpile war going on Twitter, you know, this author, that author. How much do you think that's going to influence what people dare to write right now? because it's really getting insidious. The reader voices are getting louder than the author voices in some cases. I'm not saying that's bad or good. I'm just saying it's a very powerful force on this decade's fantasy. Tough question.
I think Star Wars, the recent Star Wars, well, the most recent Star Wars movies should be an example of why you don't always listen to your audience or a section of your audience just because they shout the loudest. Because I think that film was definitely overly influenced by fan reaction. I think as a writer, you can't write to reader expectations. You can't, because you just cannot please everyone. It's impossible. All you can ever do is write what you want to write, and people react to it as they will react to it. I don't think you really have much of an alternative.
Yeah, okay. I agree.
So one of the things that always interests me is like how magic systems evolve. You know, I wanted to ask you guys about magic systems through the last decades and what maybe your favorite magic system that you've read was and why.
Magic system. Now you're going into it. Got
yes.
the books, their rule books into fantasy. I don't buy any of it. I like to be drawn into a book, and I don't care what they're doing for a system. It's either going to agree with me or they're going to give me the rule book on the second page, and I'm going to get very bored with the book very quickly. So I don't go for this. What do I think of magic systems? It all depends on the magic the author's putting on the page. How good are they at convincing me it's real? I don't need a rule book.
Yeah, I think I had the opinion that if you can explain it, it's not magic, it becomes sort of science. So to keep it to be true magic, it's going to have to be something that is somewhat inexplicable. So, I mean, Tolkien's was very subtle, and I liked less magic rather than more. So I would have gone with something like that. But I kind of feel that if you're able to explain too much of it, other than just the cost, the sacrifice, or what you have to do to accomplish it, so it makes sense in a plot sense. Yeah, I would actually have to agree with Jenny on that I don't really buy into the system so much, because then it becomes too scientific to me, and it's no longer that wondrous magical ability that you experience.
Okay.
I take a different approach. I like a set of rules because I like to know what magic can and can't do, so that magic can't just come in and solve a plot problem without explanation, because I find that usually very disappointing and frustrating. So while you do want to leave a little room for magic to be magic, I like to set up rules so that the reader can understand like what this can do and what this can't do, and have a certain level of expectation on it. Whereas if you have a magic system that just allows anything to happen at any time, it can become a escape route for an author who's stuck in a problem and just doesn't want to solve it, or who wants to provide like an easy out for something. Like you get your characters into a horrible mess, and then like, well, I've always got the escape route of magic can do anything that lets you get out of it. So I think there's a balance there where you want the reader's expectations to be managed as to what things can be solved by magic and what things need to be solved by their characters, like wit and wisdom. But you also want to keep a sense of wonder in the story, and so it's a balancing act. If you go too far in either direction, you can fall.
Okay.
I would agree with what you said, but I don't like seeing the system in my face.
That's fair. That's totally fair. And I try and keep it.
What is it?
I have rule books for my magic system that I don't share, so people want them sometimes, and some of it you keep secret so that I know what the rules are, even if no one else does.
Okay.
What does Anthony think?
Yeah, Anthony, what do you think?
I think for a magic system to work, I think you agree with Michael that there's have to be an air of mystery about it, for me anyway. But for it to work in the context of a narrative that has drama and jeopardy and so on, you have to have limits to it. You can't do everything. And there has to be a price. I think there should always be some kind of price for using it that it exacts, because therein lies the drama. And you can, creating rules for it, it can work for a narrative. It puts constraints on the characters or puts obstacles in their way that they have to overcome and so forth. I mean, I'm struggling actually to think of a favourite magic system at the moment. I mean, we're all, I guess, Brandon Sanderson's bound to come out whenever you talk about
Mistborn.
Mistborn, yeah, it's a great magic system. An example of how the rules of it actually inform the course of the narrative. Blanking on those at the moment.
Boy, did anybody read C.J.
Okay,
Cherry's Eye of Time? The magic in that is amazing. She really did a job in that book. Almost no one's read it. It's a pity. Yeah, she uses mason's lines and where they laid the bricks and how they positioned the buildings and the walls and the magic. It has to do with the magic. It's really well done and brilliant.
Which book is that?
Fortress
CJ?
Eye of Time.
I hate to break in here.
Go ahead, Michael.
What's up, Michael?
I hate to break in here, but I'm going to have to leave because my power is running dead, and I have to get out of the parking lot as well. So I apologize for not having to be here at right time. Sometimes life gets in the way. So thanks for having me, but I got to go. I don't know how I might be disappearing any second. So
thank you, Michael, for being here.
You're going to give him a chance.
All right, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Give him a chance to talk about his work before he leaves.
Oh, do you want to say something about what you got going on? Michael?
Oh, God, no. No, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me at all. You guys can talk behind my back. It's perfectly fine. That's okay. But, yeah, no, I have books coming out. People know me. If they can, they just look me up. We just talked about discoverability with Peter and Janny. They can find it. All right. Thanks all, and nice seeing all of you again. I think I know every single one here except possibly the moderator. So thank you, and I'm sorry I have to bug out, but bye-bye.
Bye. Have a nice day.
Have fun freezing your butt in Florida.
That's pretty funny. No, God, I don't care. If the audience has any questions, go ahead and ask them in the chat. I'm winding down here with what I have prepared. So my last question, well, actually second to last question is, there's been a lot of movie and television adaptations. Seems like that's sort of the going thing to do right now. They're becoming increasingly popular. What are some adaptations that studios got right and some that maybe missed the mark tonally or world building wise? Do you guys have any?
Well, the elephant in the room is Game of Thrones. I think we got it mostly right, but we might not want to spend the next hour talking about the last season or the last episode.
Which season was that? It ended at 7.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
It's like
I think I dropped it. In terms of one I thought didn't work very well recently was, did anyone watch Cursed? I think it was called Cursed on Netflix. It was an adaptation of, I think, a Frank Miller illustrated novel. I don't think many people watched it, and it was kind of a redoing of the Arthurian fable from a female perspective. It kind of fell a bit flat. So, I suppose we should talk about Wheel of Time. I watched it. It's a bit mad. I found it a bit bland, to be honest. I wasn't really invested in any of the characters.
The
fridging in the first episode was difficult.
Guys, I don't have TV and I don't have streaming. So we saw Dune yesterday because we bought it. So I'm sort of going to not be active in this conversation for obvious reasons. I read more books than I take in media.
So I liked Wheel of Time. It's different from the books. but not in a
Mhm.
way that I don't like. I think that they did what they needed to do to modernize it and to make it a little more palatable to a mainstream audience. And I was watching it with my partner who had never read the books and had no experience with the books, and therefore she was really into it and really invested in it. And that said a lot to me about the quality of the show, like in a way that like I'm judging it against all of this knowledge that I already have, whereas she's just going into it cold. The fridging that you're referring to is Perrin's partner?
It's Perrin's partner. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the word fridging is thrown around maybe more than it's accurate, because fridging is a very specific thing. Whereas not every character that dies is fridged, you know, and not like
Sure.
I think, and what was interesting is that character was made up for the show. It wasn't a character from the books, and I was kind of disconcerted by that because it sort of changed the nature of Perrin in a lot of ways right from the start. Like added a lot more to that character than was originally there. It was off-putting, I agree.
I thought they did a pretty good job with The Expanse, actually, because I haven't read the book first and then come to the adaptation second. The Expanse did a pretty good job of capturing that. I haven't seen the last season, so don't wreck it for me.
Yeah,
I thought Dune was pretty beautiful.
Dune, this version of Dune was what I wish that we'd had in 1980. It really did it. It really did it. All the things I remember from the book were in there. They cut out just the right amount of stuff. It was very powerful, very stark, very powerful.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see
think
what
David Lynch did what he could with the material, you know, with the special effects technology and the materials at hand back in the day. But this was so much.
Oh, the film script for the 1980s version was just so bad. I was asked to be on an interview on a radio show before that came out. And I was so excited for that movie. And what I said on that show was I really expected that Dune movie to take science fiction and make it for adults. That it was a really powerful story, that it was going to take it out of Kittyville. And the movie was so disappointing. All those little thought balloons inside of people's heads. It was not well adapted in the script.
Yeah.
This movie did it right. So we'll see what they do with the second, if they run away with the success and make it crazy, or if they can really make the material what it could be. So that was when I thought they did right, but I just saw it. So just barely. I haven't seen The Wheel of Time. I'll have to wait till it's available.
Yeah.
And of course, there's Lord of the Rings.
Funny how they did the first one so well, and then they just kept departing. Each one that came after it got further and further away.
You mean the Lord of the Rings movies, or are you referring to the
Lord of
Hobbit
the Rings
that
movies.
got off the track?
Yeah, the Fellowship of the Ring was so well done because they captured the heart of the story, and then they just began to inch it and put other things in there or make other things important that weren't. I've had fights over it. You know, the whole thing with the scenes with Denethor eating the fruit and making him just into some kind of a weird guy. Well, he was supposed to be crazy from the Palantir, and they never made that connection. They never showed what corrupted him and made him crooked. So each book took something like that and pushed it a little further to the edge in a different direction than the books really did. So the more sequels they did, the more disappointed I got. I still think it's a successful movie, but did it lose the heart of the book at the very end? It almost did.
I don't know. Like I'm a firm believer that books and television shows and movies are paced differently, and they're paced differently for a reason, because the time you have to develop a story and the ability to develop a story is vastly different when you change a medium. And so a certain amount of variation from the text is essential, and it has to be done well, but you can't have a thing be exactly like the book, or else
I didn't say it needed to be exactly like the book. They made alterations.
I didn't say that you did. I was building to a point. But I do feel like that original trilogy very much for me kept to the spirit of the books and made me feel like this is Lord of the Rings, but presented for a modern audience in a way that's much more accessible to mainstream people who are not familiar with fantasy. And it created enough depth, but also sort of expanded on some things so that like there were a couple of women in the movie and, which like maybe we needed.
But when they started, The Hobbit really went crazy. I'm talking about the scene with the barrels and the.
No, The Hobbit was. I refused to watch the third Hobbit movie because it just went. There were occasional scenes in The Hobbit where like, wow, that's exactly how I imagined Gollum's cave. But then there was also all this other stuff that was sort of shoehorned into the story that took this like beautiful little book that I loved as a kid and made it something that I didn't recognize anymore. And so that was definitely a barrier for me as somebody who loved the book, that I was not able to enjoy those movies the same way.
It made it like a D&D movie. And The Hobbit
was... The D&D movie, we should not talk about it because I'll get angry.
The greed was there. The kernel of it was there. But all that excessive stuff to the side where they just went nuts took away from that.
Yeah. But I've got no regrets that they cut out Tom Bombadil. Like, we don't need, didn't need that. we didn't need 30 minutes of him singing about his socks like in the middle of the story.
In terms of great adaptations recently, wasn't TV, but Audible's adaptation of The Sandman.
Oh, yes.
Which I thought was just sublime. It's just everything I wanted it to be. In terms of successful adaptations, that one's going to be hard to beat. I'm interested to see what they do with the Netflix series, but I imagine they'll be making a lot more changes than they did for the Audible.
That medium is what really interests me right now, is that like once audio became detached from the CD and like you could stream it to your device, the audio market took off. The audio market used to be a rounding error in fiction, and now it's 40% of the market. And while like a unabridged audiobook with a single narrator can really powerfully tell the story of that book, there's a new subgenre of that with full cast audio with music and sound effects and really like creating an audio drama like an old-timey radio play. And I think that more studios are starting to put that together. Graphic Audio is the one that's been doing it for a while, but now you see Audible and other companies like wanting a slice of that pie as well. And I think that it's really expanding the market for audio in a way that I really like, because with a 5-year-old in the house, there's no time to sit around and read at home. So usually I'll just listen to audiobooks while I'm walking in the park or something like that. And having sometimes having one narrator telling you it is great, but other times it's much more exciting to have a performance, where characters are arguing with each other for real and like putting the right inflection on the words that, the single narrator just can't do, but two people arguing with each other can. And so I think it's an exciting time in the audio market, and that we're going to see a lot of new things like that happening. Sandman was like the beginning of that becoming more mainstream.
I think what you're talking about is a lot more effective depending on the style of the writing. If the writing is more script oriented, that kind of an audio performance would be stellar. If the writing leans more into style or has more imaginative use of words or uses language in a different way, then the single narrator who knows how to bring that out might be the better route. So I don't think it's one size fits all.
Of course not. Although a lot of these audio dramas will have a narrator who reads the non-dialogue prose. They'll just replace all of the dialogue, and any descriptions of a sound will be replaced with the sound itself, and any descriptions of music will be replaced with music. And like, if you enter a crowded feast hall, like you'll hear the chatter of people talking in the background or whatever. But you still have a narrator to do those long sort of bits of prose that don't translate as well to the actors. But so it's a balance. And again, it's a personal taste issue.
Further away from imagination in a way.
Yeah, in some ways. But I think it's an issue of personal taste. that market was really big for long haul truckers and people who drive professionally. And I asked about that, because there was like one section of my audiobooks, the unabridged ones that like were going to my main readership. And then there was this whole other readership that was reading the audio dramas. And I asked about it and they said, well, look, if you're driving for 18 hours and you're listening to like one voice that's sort of like droning, it can lull you to sleep. But if you're listening to the same story with bangs and crashes and sound effects and people arguing with each other, it's much more likely to keep you like alert and awake. And I never really thought of it that way, but it's true. And so I think that it's sort of fascinating to get your work out to a market that otherwise wouldn't have been able to enjoy it because a single narrator was just too droning and not effective for the type of listening that they needed at the time.
That's something I wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah.
I hadn't either until they explained it to me, but once they explained it to me, it made a lot of sense. So this is the sort of thing where like you're drawn to what you're drawn to. So you just want to make sure that if someone adapts your work, you make it as quality as possible so that they get as much of the experience that you meant as possible. Because it's only going to adapt further, I think.
Okay.
Wait till you get the VR books.
They're coming, I'm sure.
Oh, it's already here. There's Star Wars ones now.
That might prove to be pretty interesting.
The Vader Immortal VR stories are actually very enjoyable. They're short and they're, but like, you really feel like you're in the middle of the story, but you also don't have much influence over the story. So you're just sort of going along, and like every once in a while they coach you through something you have to do, but the story evolves the same way no matter what. And I think that it's sort of a nice little like Star Wars novella in a different medium. I don't know that I would be able to get through a whole novel that way, but in short bursts, it's fun.
Okay. We have a question from the audience. What were the top 3 fantasy books the panelists read in 2021?
I read Fires of Vengeance. That was Evan Winter's sequel to Rage of Dragons. That book was fantastic. Let me look at my...
I read Hand of the Sun King by J.T. Greathouse, which was really good. I know I've read more than 3, but
Adrian Tchaikovsky's 10-book trilogy, 10-book series, which I'm still waiting for the last 3 to come because they're not in print back until March. But yeah, Shadows of the Apt, brilliant, totally brilliant.
I read The Burning God, which was the 3rd book in Rebecca Kwong's Poppy War trilogy, which that whole trilogy is amazing. It's brutal, but I loved it so much. She's an incredible new voice. I also really liked Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir.
I love that book.
More science fiction, but captures a lot of the magic that The Martian had, where the science is close enough to our modern science that like you have to do like that he had to do the math in order to make it work. But there were a couple of conceits that allowed it to be a much more to stray a little further than The Martian did. And so I really enjoyed that book quite a bit.
I also really liked Artifact Space by Miles Cameron. Really, really nicely done space opera that really gets into the house and the great characters and great action, just start to finish. That book was brilliantly conceived and well done. I ripped right through it. It was quite fun.
The other one that comes to mind for me is, it's not out yet. I read an ARC book called Penny Blade. JT, what's his name? His surname's Warrard, and blanking on his first name, which is embarrassing. But yeah, that's a really good book, sort of kind of visceral fantasy, which draws on a lot of the modern tropes, but completely sort of reinvents them or takes a very different angle upon them. Yeah, so that'd be a recommendation as well.
So I read
Blood of the Spear. It's a self-published, it's a debut, and it started very much like The Ordinary. Here comes the epic fantasy where the kids are being bullied, but he took that start and he took it so fast and so far in just one volume. By the time I finished it, my jaw dropped. So it'll be curious to see where that guy goes after this book, because I think he's got something. It was pretty amazing read for a self-pub. It just blew me away because of the way he developed the world and expanded on the very, very tightly knit beginning.
Peter, what were you going to say?
The Gollum and the Genie by Helene Wecker it's a historical fantasy set in like close to turn of the century New York City. What was that, Janny?
New York City. Yeah, I read that one.
It's really an amazing book and sort of an interesting take on fantasy. Like, she does a lot more research than I do because she had to set it in the real world and use incorporated both sort of Jewish mythology and like just it's a beautifully constructed story that is part historical fiction and part fantasy. Absolutely worth your time.
We have another question. Do you think studios will take more risk adapting fantasy series that used to be considered impossible to adapt?
Right now, probably yes. In 10 more years or 5 more years, when they figured out what goes and what doesn't, it will narrow like everything else. Because
they're actively doing it.
Mm-hmm.
What?
They're actively doing it now. I mean, the Wheel of Time was considered unmakeable as a show not that long ago, and like that's a big roll of the dice. People tried to make Lord of the Rings forever before that happened. We have a level of special effects technology and that sort of blew the doors off and made a lot of things that were previously impossible very possible. And so I think that we're going to see more of that. I don't know what really counts as unmakeable at this point.
They still haven't made Neuromancer, which, seems incredible, but when you think
they
about it. They
haven't made Neuromancer, really?
No, they've made various other William Gibson things, but not to any great success. But Neuromancer has never actually been made. And I think the difficulty with it isn't the visuals, it's the capturing the nuance of that world and the characters and so on. It's a hard thing to adapt. But it'd be nice if somebody took that on.
Jim Butcher has a series that has blimps that fight. You guys,
the Aeronaut's Windlass.
Yes, that might be
on my list. Yeah, it's a hornblower with airships. I think, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah. Okay. Where I'm just gonna wind down here. Where do you think fantasy is going in this decade?
No limit. There's no limit. It's fantasy. How can you sit there and say you can predict where it's going to go when imagination can go anywhere? I don't think anybody knows the next step, and I like it.
And we haven't even been able to predict where the real world is going to go the last couple of years. I think the pandemic is definitely going to have an effect on artistic output for the next 10 years at least. It's already had its effect in making it a lot harder for debut authors the last couple of years to get noticed and to get the attention that they deserve. Those of us who were a little bit established prior to the pandemic, I think, had a slightly easier time. But it's also it's so dramatically affected, it's affected the way we work because, you know, I'm trying to work around kids in the house and Zoom schooling and exhaustion, but it's also created this level of sort of existential angst and worry and like questions about human nature that, you know, and surprises about human nature that we weren't really expecting, that I think are going to influence people's creativity, whether they like it or not. So I don't really know how all that's going to play out, but I'm kind of excited to see it. I think that like art is going to be different this decade than it was in the last decade.
I know that I've spent some time during this time where everybody's been locked down by picking and choosing some newer authors coming up that are complete unknowns, and some ones that I know that are not as well known as they should be. And I've taken a bunch of time in the last couple of years while we've been locked down to push, help, and promote their books, to get them out there and get them seen. If everybody helped 5 people that had a name going, we could help mitigate some of this inability to get out. So I've made an effort to reach out to some of these guys and help them, you know, and the gals too, to raise awareness that there's other work coming out that's new that people may not have heard of at all.
Like who?
Paige Christie. She wrote something called Dragon Weather. She's got 3 books out in that series, and she's writing the 4th. It's just about done in draft. It takes the dragon sacrifice myth and completely turns it upside down and on its head. It's very originally written. It's very well done. She's from a very tiny press that does no publicity, so you won't have heard of her, but it's high quality work right there. I mentioned Mark Timoney. I mentioned Miles Cameron. Mm-hmm. I mentioned Adrian Tchaikovsky, that I feel like his work should be way more recognized than it is. So there's just a little handful, a very small handful, and I'm adding. Often I've been following a lot more authors, and when they mention a book they got coming out, if I read their book before and liked it, or if I was curious, I reached out and read it, then I will quote tweet their tweet and I'll say why I like the book. So I've spent a lot more time doing that in the last 2 years. Even as busy as I've been, I felt like I could give a half an hour a day to help spread the awareness, spread the love, because the more good books we have, the more readers we'll have, the more people will have to enjoy the work. And the happier I am because I get to read more of what I love.
Yeah. The pandemic book that I expected to be a big hit was Stealing Thunder by Lena Boyden. I had read that book right before the pandemic hit, and I absolutely loved it. I read the entire book. I started reading it on the cab to the Paris airport and basically blacked out. And by the time I was home in New York, I was almost done with it. Could not stop reading it. And so I was expecting it to have this massive, massive launch. And then it came out during lockdown when all the bookstores were closed. And I think it just never got the attention that it deserved.
What was the name of it again?
Stealing Thunder by Alina Boyden.
Okay, I'll look it up.
So good. The sequel is out already. It was only a 2-book series, so you can just read the whole thing. But I think that a lot of authors had that same situation where, like, there were good books coming out in 2020 that just no one could read because the bookstores were closed and the algorithms weren't interested because they were new.
Same thing happened after 9/11. Lots of books fell in that pit. Huge pit happened at that time. So yeah, definitely world events can crash into, but we can make a difference there. Maybe only a little one, but we can.
Yeah.
Have you guys read Master of Sorrows or Master Artificer by Justin Call?
Not yet.
No.
I've heard of it. So it's on the radar.
I've seen the cover.
Yeah,
I've never heard of it.
It's spectacular.
Read that many books when I'm loaded with this huge deadline. You know, I just finished the finish of an 11-book series. I just finished the entire draft. So I was managing to read, but it was really slowed down compared to my usual output.
Yeah. Peter, are you looking it up?
I am absolutely looking it up right now.
Just absolutely incredible, wonderful story.
Yeah.
It's kind of the rise of the bad guy. instead of, the hero's journey. It's about the bad guy, the guy who becomes evil. It's yeah.
It's a beautiful looking book too.
Yeah, he does good stuff. Okay, well, I just want to thank everybody for coming. If you guys want to talk about what you got going on and where we can find you, that would be great. So, Janny, do you want to go first?
Well, I don't like doing this. I'm easy to find. My name is Janny Wurts. I'm the only one in the world. So if you spell it correctly, you will find me. I just completed the 11th volume of The Wars in Light and Shadows, and that is the finish. So it's going into production. And there's 20 novels and 36 short stories out there. You can find me. You can see samples on the website. I don't need to talk about me. I'd rather talk about somebody else.
Anthony?
20 novels.
Well, what's this over here? I just happen to have a copy of The Pariah, first in the Covenant of Steel, which is already out. The sequel will be out in June this year, called Martha. All the information about me and my books is at Woman of Taste and Distinct. All the information about me is on anthonyryan.net. You can find everything you need there.
Can you give me a what The Pariah is about, like one sentence?
It's an unashamed cod medieval fantasy about a outlaw who has many dark adventures.
Wow.
You can find me at petervbrett.com or on any social media at pvbrett, PVBRETT. So I try to at least have a foothold on everything. I started a TikTok. My Demon Cycle series is complete at 5 books, so it's ready to binge and dive right in. Just this past August, I released book 1 of the Nightfall Saga, which is set in the same world 15 years after the Demon Cycle, but it is designed so that you can pick it up without having read any of the previous books and just go from jump. Or if you've read the previous series, you'll see a lot of characters that you recognize, but in more supporting cast positions rather than being main characters. So I think it's a nice continuation for longtime readers, but it's also something fun and tonally different for a new reader who just wants to try me out. On sale now. Working hard on the sequel in between Zoom school lessons.
Okay, I want to thank the audience for a lot of the comments and questions. It's been a real fun conversation to watch develop along here.
And thank you, Beth.
Oh, of course, my pleasure.
Wrangling these cats.
Yeah, she did a nice job.
Thank you.
It's great to meet you guys. I don't think I've met either one of you in person at a con yet. I've definitely read your work. But so it's great to see you kind of face to face over distance.
I made it to Worldcon this year. It was it was sparsely attended, let's say. I'm hoping that this coming year we'll start to see each other again in person. World Fantasies in New Orleans.
Ooh, that'd be fun.
Yeah, still a year away, so we can dream that the pandemic will be over by then.
Yeah. The thing that just keeps going and going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you. You guys
Thanks,
have a great day.
Okay.